Welcome to Vicom's Harian Weekly podcast. I'm really pleased to welcome Kate Bauer today from the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Kate is a fellow at the Institute and a former US Treasury official with a long track record of experience on terrorist finance, sanctions. She is the perfect person for us to be talking to this week about the US squeeze on Iran and the new sanctions that were reimposed on Iran by the US administration. Welcome, Kate. Good morning to you. Good afternoon for me.
Thank you, James. Pleasure to be with you.
So if we could just kick off, I mean, what I wanted to ask first of all is, which parts of the Iranian economy do you think these sanctions are really targeted at most? Or is it the intention to try and put a squeeze on almost every element that matters for the Iranian regime?
So yes, the deadline that came through on Monday, of course, was the end of a 180-day wind down period that the U.S. administration had put in place when they withdrew from the nuclear deal in May. And essentially what they did is they snapped back all of the sanctions relief that had been extended to Iran under the deal. And so I think it's helpful to think about it that way. What was suspended? What value did Iran get from the measures that were suspended? And so those were the suspension of secondary sanctions. That means those sanctions that messaged to foreign firms that they had to make a choice between doing business with Iran and doing business with the U.S., because if they did significant transactions with designated Iranian entities, that they faced losing access to the U.S. financial system. Of course, another aspect was the resumption of Iranian oil sales, and related to that, access to that revenue. And so those are the things that went away. And I think it's helpful to look at those and see how now that affects Iran. One thing to keep in mind is that what Iran thought it would get from the relief from the JCPOA was reintegration into the global financial system. And that didn't really come to pass because firms and financial institutions were wary of doing business with Iran, in part because of the sanctions overhang, but also for many other reasons. And so, in some ways, I think this reapplication of sanctions, won't be as, you won't see as extreme an impact as others may have expected. Also, you started to see it immediately when this wind down period was announced. Firms started to pull away.
So what I was going to ask is to what extent does this play to the regime's strength? I mean, there's a lot of talk about the fact that the Islamic Republic is kind of set up to sort of flip back into a kind of siege mentality, that they have a very cohesive set of companies that spread very deep into the Iranian economy, run by the IRGC, and that it's not that difficult for them to move into a sort of resistance economic model where the people are sort of ever more reliant on those elements of the regime, and they can just sort of have this siege mentality and blame any hardships on the squeeze from the US. Do you think that they are able to actually benefit from that, or do you think that the squeeze just ends up being too vast for them to be able to benefit?
Well, I think that there's no doubt that the IRGC and elements of the regime beyond that can benefit from the resistance economy. And I think this isn't a new phenomenon. I think it's something that the regime has done. Of course, the U.S. embargo has been in place in varying kind of degrees of intensity for 4 decades now. But if you look at the sectors that these sanctions target, shipping, shipbuilding, the ports, automotive sectors, and of course energy, what the sanctions are fundamentally going after is depriving the regime of access to hard revenue, access to hard currency. And that's what you see when you see the oil sanctions. And the waivers that were given, that were announced on Monday for certain countries that were importing Iranian oil to be able to continue those imports, but being required to keep those revenues locked up. And so by depriving the regime of access to hard currency, the idea is to limit its capabilities to be able to engage in procurement or make it harder to provide sponsorship to proxies and engage in activities in the region that are destabilizing. But there's no doubt that this also is having an impact on the Iranian currency. We've seen the value of the Iranian rial fall quite a bit over the summer and continue to be quite volatile, and in turn inflation. And there's no doubt that has an impact on the people of Iran as well.
Mm. And the impact, even before the sanctions, as you mentioned, had already started in terms of the major international companies say they were pulling out, and it's having that impact that people who have significant presence in the US economy just will not risk their presence in the US market and will just pull out. But this talk about Europe setting up this mechanism to bypass it, I mean, do you see that just as their attempt to just keep the deal, the JCPOA and its benefits for Iran alive? Or do you think there's actually some real mileage there to do something? Because it was interesting this week that there was real fighting talk from France about how they were really going to set this up, even though there was a slightly comical situation where no European country seemed to want to actually have it in their country because they feared the consequences. But French diplomats this week were really talking this up, and there was even some mention of trying to boost the euro as a currency of note for this kind of trade as against the dollar. I mean, do you see there's mileage in this European mechanism?
Well, I think one of the ironies of the special purpose vehicle that the Europeans have proposed, and that the other signatories to the JCPOA have said they would support, including the Chinese, is that it's very similar to the dynamic that these significant reduction exemptions or waivers set up, in that it's essentially a barter system. So what Europe has said is we want to continue purchasing oil from Iran and use that money to finance our trade. And so now that these 8 waivers have been issued, China, India, South Korea, Japan, Turkey, Greece, and Italy will be able to do that. They will be able to keep those revenues in country to finance bilateral trade. And I think what you see, why the Europeans, kind of the evolution of the European response over the last 6 months to this special purpose vehicle was a recognition that that countries who oppose this move by the U.S. can't necessarily protect their companies from U.S. sanctions, and those firms that have exposure in the U.S. that want to maintain their access to U.S. markets and to the U.S. dollar are going to go against the position that their governments have taken from a political perspective. So I think what you do have is the longer that these sanctions are in place, for now you have the waivers. So you have the ability to have some trade, but the revenue not going to Iran. The longer this is in place, and there's this divide between the commercial decision for companies to withdraw from Iran and countries maintaining the political position that they don't, that they're not on board with the sanctions, it's more likely that there will be firms that are either set up or spun off that don't have exposure to the U.S. That will be able to engage in some trade. And I think that's kind of, that's the medium-term concern. And that's what you get from this dynamic where you don't have the strategic alignment, between the U.S. and Europe and countries in Asia. And so you'll see the possibility of that, not immediately perhaps, but in the medium term. And you'll also see some leakage from these escrow accounts, from these frozen revenues, like you did last time. So now that the sanctions have gone back into place, the end of the wind down period, and that was a really big lift from the professionals at the Treasury Department and at the State Department who work on these issues. The next thing to look at is where the evasion is going to take place, and how to use the tools that they have, a lot of which come into effect with this resumption of sanctions, but maybe didn't play out. You didn't see any application of secondary sanctions immediately, of course, because that's only the beginning of when that becomes, activity that can be penalized. But that's the next step.
the sanctions waivers, they're supposed to be time limited, aren't they? But I can't see a situation where Russia, for instance, is gonna do anything other than just say to the US, look, we're not playing ball. We're just going to carry on trading with Iran. I mean, how does the US get around that?
Well, so the waivers, these significant reduction exemptions, they go to Iran's oil trading partners. So that doesn't include Russia, but they went to these 8 countries. And what they say is you've reduced the amount of Iranian oil you're importing, and so we're going to give you a waiver to continue at a certain level. And over that period, we expect to see another reduction and at that point we will extend it. That's how they were put in place last time, at least, looking at the playbook from the last time around. What the administration has said is that some of those countries are very close to going to zero, so you wouldn't expect to see those waivers extended. But with countries like China that was given a waiver, it's not such a bad deal for the Chinese. They're allowed to continue to import a certain amount of Iranian oil, and there's also reports that they're allowed to continue imports of oil that they get from equity that they have in from investment that they've made in the Iranian energy sector, where in normal times you wouldn't see any payments. And so the sanctions really, as I said before, go after Iran's access to hard currency. And so as long as there were no payments associated with those other imports, it appears they're going to be able to continue to do that as well.
How does China then pay for the oil? How does that, sorry, excuse my ignorance, but how does then the transaction take place? So Iran exports the oil to China, and China does what?
Well, so for a certain amount of that oil, they'll have to keep that revenue in an escrow account that can only be used to finance bilateral trade. So what that means is that Iran can use those monies in Chinese currency to buy Chinese goods, and that's a good deal for the Chinese as well, because they want Iran to be a market for their goods, and it locks Iran into that. Of course, the balance of trade will probably mean that there will be revenues that will accrue in China and in India and in other places like it did last time around. And those are the funds that Iran got access to when the sanctions relief initially went into effect. But those were, significant amounts of money, and that's what you see is that they have this money that they can't access, they can't use, and that's what creates the pressure on the Iranian economy and on the Iranian regime.
And we talked a bit before about the people trying to avoid sanctions, and I've read of very creative efforts. Lots of Iranian nationals becoming citizens of obscure small Caribbean islands and setting up businesses there and doing all sorts of things in terms of accounts being routed via Venezuela. I mean, are we going to start seeing this over the next few months? These very creative ways of trying to get around the sanctions, and surely that's a big enforcement challenge, isn't it, for the US Treasury to try and sort of seal this activity and crack down on it? How do you see that working?
Of course, I think Iran has a very established sanctions evasion networks, and I think one thing you saw even under the period of relief was that these networks did not go away. Because of the difficulties Iranian firms faced and Iranian financial institutions faced in reintegrating into the global financial system, they were still, to a certain degree, reliant on these networks that allowed them to obfuscate the Iranian interest in transactions. And so, because people didn't necessarily want to be doing business with them, and there were a couple public cases of that where you saw that they continue to do it. So they're going to go back to these evasion networks, and they're going to find new and creative ways to be able to move money through trade-based money laundering and other evasive techniques. And it does take a big effort from the Treasury Department and other parts of the U.S. government to track it, but when they have to use these evasive techniques, it raises the cost of doing business. It makes it more difficult and more costly, and more likely that financial institutions and firms that might be a step or two removed from this activity are going to be even more careful and less likely to engage in it. So I think a good example of this actually is Kunlun Bank, which is a Chinese bank that was sanctioned last time around because it continued to deal with Iranian banks. And it continued even during the period of relief, both to remain on sanctions lists and deal with Iranian banks. But within the last couple of weeks said that it was stopping its business with Iranian clients. And I think there's possibly a couple of reasons it's made that decision now, which seems like an odd time to make the decision. But, one is its parent is a Chinese oil company, CNPC, and the CNPC might feel exposure to sanctions through being the parent of Kunlun Bank. But I think what's also very likely is other Chinese banks are saying, given this very aggressive enforcement posture that the U.S. government is taking, we don't want to have any connection to Kunlun. So they can't continue to operate this way, and they have to change their behavior. So I think you have in this day and age, perhaps different from even just a few years ago when sanctions were being implemented, you have a lot of vigilance in the financial sector to this sort of activity and really a risk aversion to being exposed to any sort of sanctions evasion.
No, that's very interesting. And just finally, I mean, this is a much bigger question, and you may not have a very well formed view at this stage, but do you think the administration is pushing here for the likelihood of regime change, to actually believe that the regime in Iran is brittle enough that it could actually fall apart? Or do you think this is a game to just put so much economic pressure on Iran that they will come back to the negotiating table and want to come and talk about a improved JCPOA? What's your hunch?
Well, I think it's a really important question, and one that's hard to kind of nail down. Of course, one of the big differences in the sanctions approach that the Trump administration is taking is that they've widened the scope of activities that they're looking for Iran to address in order to resume negotiations. So the JCPOA, of course, was limited scope. It was a nuclear deal. Iran agreed to certain nuclear constraints in return for relief from nuclear sanctions. As you probably know, Secretary Pompeo gave a speech over the summer where he laid out 12 points where they expected, laying out the expectation that Iran would need to change behavior across all of these fronts, and it included much more than the nuclear deal. And so that's what's kind of fed the suspicions, amongst other things, that the real objective of the administration is regime change. I think it's hard to create a viable path to negotiations as long as it hasn't been articulated amid these suspicions. And it's one of the challenges too going forward, trying to pursue a diplomatic effort when there's not alignment with Europe and with countries in Asia like there was before, because as long as there's rhetorical weight that goes into having a multilateral coalition that's just absent, even if there's been kind of this immediate tactical success on the pressure that's been built through the sanctions. The effort is lacking that kind of rhetorical weight that it did have before. So I'd say that the path forward at this point isn't very clear. But that, kind of the conventional wisdom is that Iran is going to try to wait out the pressure, perhaps through the end of the Trump administration if it can. And so I think it remains to be seen, exactly how much pressure these sanctions can bring beyond, the impacts we saw kind of very quickly after the announcement of the U.S. withdrawal, and how the regime will respond to that.
Kate, thank you so much for joining us from Washington, D.C. That's been a really excellent overview of all the issues, and I hope to speak to you again soon. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.